They say a reputation is like fine porcelain. Once shattered, it can never be truly mended, only glued back together with scars that catch the light. But Lady Clara did not just shatter, she was erased. In the space of a single heartbeat, amidst the scent of damp boxwood and the cruel laughter of a summer midnight, a diamond of the first water was ground into the dirt. This is not a story of a lady who wept, it is the story of a woman who burned her world to ashes to save those who didn't deserve her, and the man who had to lose his soul to finally find his heart. Before we begin this tale of betrayal and redemption, please subscribe and like this video. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from and what era of history captures your heart the most. Chapter 1. The Fall of the Rose. The night of the Hartley Ball had begun with the promise of a fairy tale. The air in the Hampshire countryside was thick with the scent of late blooming roses and the distant melodic strain of a quadrille. Lady Clara stood at the edge of the ballroom, her breath catching in her throat as she caught sight of him. Julian, the Duke of Ravenstock, was a man carved from granite and moonlight. To the rest of the ton, he was a figure of formidable authority and cold precision. But to Clara, he was the man who had whispered promises of a shared future against her temple only 2 nights prior. He was her anchor, he was her home. "You look as though you're plotting a revolution, or perhaps just a very elegant escape," a voice whispered near her ear. Clara turned to see Louisa, Julian's younger sister, her face pale and her eyes darting toward the open French doors that led to the gardens. Louisa was barely 19, a fragile bird in a cage of silk, and tonight she looked as though she were about to break. "Louisa, what is it?" Clara asked, her voice dropping to a concerned low. "I have been a fool, Clara, a desperate, wretched fool," Louisa hissed, clutching a crumpled slip of paper in her gloved hand. "He is here, in the maze. He says if I do not come, he will post the letters to the Gazette tomorrow." Clara felt a cold chill that had nothing to do with the evening breeze. She knew of the man Louisa spoke of, a bottom-feeding blackmailer who had been circling the edges of the Duke's social circle. If Louisa was seen with him, or if those letters were published, Julian's sister would be ruined, and the house of Ravenstock would be dragged through the mire. "Stay here," Clara commanded, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. "Go to the retiring room. If anyone asks, you have a migraine. I will handle this." "Clara, no." "Go, Louisa." Clara slipped into the night, the silk of her pale pink gown whispering against the stone terrace. The garden maze was a labyrinth of shadows, the moonlight casting long, jagged fingers across the gravel paths. She moved with a desperate purpose, her mind racing. She would find the man, buy the letters, and be back before the next dance ended. She reached the center of the maze, but there was no blackmailer. Instead, she found Lord Sterling, the most notorious rake in Europe, leaning against a stone fountain, a smirk playing on his lips. "Lady Clara," he drawled, his eyes roaming over her with a calculated insolence. "I expected the little sister, but the future Duchess is a much more interesting prize." "The letters, Sterling. Name your price and give them to me," Clara said, stepping forward. But before he could answer, a twig snapped. The heavy tread of boots echoed on the gravel. Suddenly, the quiet garden was flooded with light from a dozen lanterns. Clara froze. Standing at the entrance of the clearing was Julian. His face, usually so controlled, was a mask of shattered disbelief. Behind him stood a group of the most influential gossips in London, their fans frozen mid-air, their eyes wide with predatory delight. Clara looked down. In the scuffle of Sterling grabbing her arm to pull her into a forced embrace, a staged tableau of passion, her bodice had been torn. Her hair, once pinned in an elegant chignon, fell in disarray around her shoulders. Her corset, loosened by the sudden violence of his grip, dipped dangerously low. To any onlooker, it was the picture of a tryst interrupted. "Julian," she breathed, her voice trembling, "it isn't what it looks like. I can explain." Julian stepped forward, his gaze raking over her disheveled state. He didn't look at Sterling, he looked only at Clara, and in his eyes she saw something far worse than anger. She saw a cold, dead vacuum where his love had been. "Explanation is unnecessary," Julian said, his voice a low, vibrating blade. "The evidence is quite comprehensive. Julian, please, listen to me." She reached out, her fingers grazing his sleeve. He flinched away as if her touch were acidic. "Do not. You have dragged my name through the filth of a garden maze with a man who treats women like sport. You have made a mockery of my trust and a ruin of your own soul." "I was helping Louisa," she wanted to scream, but Louisa's face flashed in her mind, the fragile girl who would not survive this scandal. If Clara told the truth, Julian would protect Louisa, but the world would still know, and Clara had realized, in that sickening moment, that the blackmailer had played them both. If she spoke, she saved herself and destroyed a girl. If she stayed silent, she lost everything. "Julian," she whispered, her eyes pleading. "You will leave," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. "You will leave this house, you will leave this county, and you will perish from my memory. From this moment forth, Lady Clara does not exist." He turned on his heel, his cloak swirling behind him like a funeral shroud. The crowd parted for him, leaving Clara standing in the center of the maze, the rubies at her throat feeling like a noose. She did not cry, not then. She watched as the man she loved walked away, leaving her to the wolves of society. That night, Lady Clara didn't just go home. She packed a single valise, took the small inheritance left by her grandmother, and walked into the fog of the London docks. The papers the next morning were merciless. The fall of the rose, they called it. The scandalous Lady Clara became a cautionary tale whispered in finishing schools. But Clara was no longer listening. She was gone. She became a ghost, a shadow in the corners of Europe, learning that when a woman has no reputation to lose, she gains a terrifying kind of power. She spent 3 years in the dark, weaving a web of her own, waiting for the moment when the Duke of Ravenstock would realize that the woman he buried was the only one who could save him from the fire he couldn't see coming. Chapter 2. The Royal Opera House was a cathedral of vanity, a place where the elite gathered to see and be seen, their diamonds competing with the guttering candlelight of the great chandeliers. But for Julian, the Duke of Ravenstock, it was merely a gilded cage. For 3 years he had moved through London like a spectre of his former self, colder, sharper, and utterly untouchable. He was the Ice Duke, a man whose heart had been cauterized in a garden maze, and whose soul had been left to wither in the frost of his own making. He sat alone in his private box, his gloved hand resting on the velvet railing. Below, the orchestra began the overture to The Martyr, a tragic opera that felt mockingly appropriate. Julian did not look at the stage. He looked at nothing. His mind was a disciplined fortress, carefully guarding the void where Clara had once resided. He had done what was necessary. He had preserved the family honor. But in the silence of his grand house, he often wondered why honor felt so much like a shroud. The heavy oak door of his box was bolted from the inside. He had no desire for company, no patience for the ambitious mothers or the simpering debutantes who still dared to hope they could melt his resolve. He was alone, as he deserved to be. Then he heard it, the distinct metallic click of the lock turning. Julian stiffened, his eyes narrowing. No usher possessed a key to this box while he was in residence, and the bolt had been thrown by his own hand. He did not turn immediately. He was a duke, and he would not be startled by a common intruder. But a scent began to drift into the small enclosed space, a fragrance that bypassed his defenses and struck him with the force of a physical blow. Sandalwood and lilies. It was a scent that belonged to a different life. It was the scent of a summer ball, of whispered promises, of a woman he had cast into the outer darkness. His heart, which he had thought dead, gave a single violent throb against his ribs. Slowly, Julian turned his head. Standing in the shadows of the doorway was a woman who looked as though she had been conjured from the very music rising from the pit. She was draped in a gown of midnight rose, a silk so dark it was nearly black, yet shimmering with deep, bruised crimson in the low light. Around her throat was a collar of rubies, each stone the size of a pigeon's egg, looking like fresh drops of blood against the porcelain perfection of her skin. A veil of black chantilly lace obscured her features, casting her in the mystery of a mourning widow or a vengeful goddess. "You are in the wrong box, madam," Julian said, his voice a rasp of velvet and steel. He stood, his tall frame casting a long shadow over her. "And you have somehow bypassed a locked door. I suggest you leave before I call the guards." The woman did not move. She did not tremble. She merely reached up, her movements fluid and agonizingly familiar, and caught the edge of the lace veil. "The guards could not keep me out 3 years ago, Julian," she whispered. Her voice was lower than he remembered, huskier, seasoned by distances he couldn't imagine. "They certainly won't keep me out tonight." She tossed the veil back. Julian's breath left him in a ragged gasp. It was Clara, but it was not the soft, bright girl he had known. Her eyes, once full of a gentle light, were now twin pools of amber fire and ancient sorrow. The roundness of youth had been replaced by the sharp, elegant planes of a woman who had survived the unthinkable. She was more beautiful than she had ever been, but it was a dangerous, haunting beauty, the kind that lured sailors to the rocks. "Clara," he choked out, the name tasting like ash and honey on his tongue. He took an involuntary step toward her, his hand reaching out as if to touch a ghost, before he caught himself. His face hardened instantly into a mask of aristocratic disdain. "How dare you? How dare you return here, to my box, wearing the jewels of whatever life you have led in the shadows?" "I am a ghost, Julian," she said, stepping into the golden light of the box. The rubies at her neck caught the flicker of the candles, casting dancing red spots onto the velvet walls. "And you are the one who buried me. Tell me, does the dirt feel heavy on your conscience, or have you found a way to sleep through the silence of your own cruelty?" The music below reached a crescendo, a soaring soprano note that seemed to vibrate in the very air between them. Julian felt his wall of indifference shattering, piece by agonizing piece. He wanted to scream at her to leave, to punish her for the 3 years of hollow ache he had endured, but he found himself unable to look away. He wanted to seize her by the shoulders, to feel the heat of her skin, to prove she was real and not a cruel trick of his grieving mind. "You were ruin," he hissed, his eyes burning with a mix of fury and a yearning so intense it frightened him. "I saw you. I saw the state of you in that maze." "You saw what you were meant to see," Clara replied, her voice steady and cold. She moved closer until the scent of her, the sandalwood and the lilies, completely overwhelmed the smell of the wax and the dust. "You saw the surface, Julian. You never once looked for the truth. You chose your pride over the woman who would have died for you." She reached into the small beaded reticule at her wrist and pulled out an object that glinted in the dim light. It was a locket, gold and tarnished, hanging from a snapped chain. Even from a distance, Julian could see the dark, brownish stains on the metal. Blood. "A ghost is a difficult thing to bury, Julian," she said, her lips almost brushing the shell of his ear as the opera surged around them, "especially when it holds the keys to your life and the secrets that will either save your house or finish what the fire started." Julian trembled. The Duke of Ravenstock, a man who feared nothing, was shaking as he stared at the blood-stained locket in her hand. The realization that he had spent 3 years hating the only soul who had truly loved him began to press down on his chest, a weight more crushing than any social ruin. Chapter 3. The music below surged into a mournful adagio, the cellos weeping a melody that seemed to pull at the very floorboards of the box. But Julian heard nothing but the roar of blood in his ears. He stared at the locket in Clara's outstretched hand. It was a macabre thing to hold in the middle of a social triumph, a piece of jewelry stained with the physical evidence of violence, held by a woman everyone believed to be dead to decent society. "Take it, Julian," Clara whispered, her voice a silken thread that bound him to the spot. "You were always so fond of evidence. You built your entire judgment of me on the sight of a torn dress and a ruined maze. Here is a different kind of proof, one that cost much more than a reputation." With fingers that felt like lead, Julian took the locket. The gold was cold, but the weight of it was immense. He fumbled with the clasp, his vision blurring. He expected to see a miniature of Lord Stirling, a final insult to his dignity. He expected a lock of hair or a memento of the affair that had shattered his world. The hinge groaned as it gave way. Inside, there was no portrait. Instead, a tiny folded scrap of vellum had been wedged into the space where a picture should have been. It was yellowed with age and stiffened by the same dark stains that marred the exterior. Julian pulled it out, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He recognized the hand immediately. It wasn't Clara's elegant flowing script. It was the frantic looping scrawl of his sister, Louisa. "Clara, please. He has the letters. He is at the maze. He says he will destroy Julian's name if I do not come alone. I am so frightened. If I am lost, tell Julian I loved him, but please help me." The world tilted. The opulent red velvet of the opera box seemed to bleed into the shadows. Julian read the words again, and then a third time, until they were burned into his retinas. The date at the top was the night of the Hartley ball. The night he had looked at the woman he loved and seen only a harlot. The night he had turned his back on the only person who was actually standing in the breach to save his family. "She was a child, Julian," Clara said, her voice devoid of pity. "She was 19 and foolish, and she had been lured into a trap by a man who knew exactly how to bleed a ducal house dry. I didn't have time to find you. I didn't have time to explain. I only had time to act. You stayed with Stirling," Julian rasped, his voice breaking. He slumped back against the velvet-lined wall, the paper trembling in his hand. I saw you in his arms. I saw the state of your clothes. I had to ensure the guards and the guests saw me, not her, Clara replied, stepping closer until she was inches from him. The scent of lilies was suffocating now, a funeral wreath for his pride. I led the scandal away from your sister and onto myself. I provoked Sterling, I fought him, and I made sure that when the lanterns were lit, the only name on anyone's lips was mine. I traded my life for Louisa's. And you didn't even ask me why I was bleeding. Julian looked up, his eyes wide and brimming with a sudden, agonizing clarity. Bleeding? Clara reached out, her gloved fingers tracing the line of his jaw, but there was no tenderness in the gesture. It was the judge of a judge. Sterling didn't just pose for that tryst, Julian. He was a brute. When I wouldn't cooperate with his theatre, he made sure I looked the part of a fallen woman. That locket, it fell during the struggle. That blood isn't Louise's, it's mine. The weight of his own cruelty finally crashed down upon him. For 3 years he had nurtured his hatred like a sacred flame. He had told himself he was the victim of a great betrayal, that his coldness was a shield for his dignity. But in the face of this truth, he saw himself for what he truly was, a coward who had believed the worst of the person he claimed to adore. He had let her walk into the night, alone and broken, while she was carrying the wounds she had taken in his name. "Clara!" he choked out, dropping to one knee in the narrow space of the box. He didn't care who saw. He didn't care if the entire ton looked up and saw the Duke of Ravenstock prostrate before a fallen woman. He reached for the hem of her midnight rose gown, his head bowing. "My God, Clara, what have I done?" "You did exactly what you were trained to do, Julian," she said, her voice finally wavering with a hint of the pain she had buried for 3 years. "You protected the Duke, but you murdered the man. And while you were busy mourning your pride, the real enemy was sitting at your table, drinking your wine and waiting for the right moment to finish what he started in that maze." Julian looked up, his face pale and etched with a new, terrifying resolve. "Tell me who. Tell me everything. I will burn London to the ground to make this right." "Rising from the ashes is a delicate business, Julian," she whispered, leaning down so their foreheads almost touched. "But tonight, the opera isn't the only tragedy being performed. The man who destroyed us is here, and he thinks he's won." The air in the box was thick with the scent of Julian's shattered world. He remained on one knee, his forehead pressed against the cold silk of Clara's skirts, a man finally broken by the weight of his own errors. But Clara did not have the luxury of his grief. She reached down, her gloved fingers catching his chin and forcing him to look up. "Stand up, Julian," she commanded, her voice like a velvet whip. "The time for your penance has not yet come. We are in the middle of a battlefield, and you are currently unarmed." Julian rose slowly, his eyes red-rimmed but fixed on her with a frightening intensity. "Tell me everything. If Sterling was the man who ruined you, why is he not the first name on my list for the gallows?" "Because Lord Sterling did not ruin me," Clara said, turning to look through the velvet curtains at the sea of faces in the stalls below. "He was a blunt instrument, yes, but he was never the architect. Sterling was an undercover agent working for my father's contacts in the Home Office. He was in that maze to intercept the blackmailer. When the lanterns appeared too early, he realized someone had tipped off the guests to ensure a scandal. He played the part of the rake to keep the focus on us, rather than letting the search find Louisa hiding in the shadows. He saved her, Julian, in the only way a man of his reputation could." Julian's breath hitched. Then who? Who hated us enough to orchestrate a 3-year exile? Clara leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper that barely carried over the soprano's tragic aria. It wasn't hate, Julian. It was greed. Who has handled your accounts since your father died? Who suggested you retreat to your northern estates and leave the management of the Ravenstock light to him while you nursed your broken heart? Julian's face went deathly pale. Holloway. Mr. Holloway, Clara confirmed, her eyes flashing with a cold, predatory light. Your most trusted attorney. For 3 years he has been systematically draining the Ravenstock coffers. He used the shame of my scandal to keep you isolated, convinced that London was laughing at you, ensuring you stayed away from the ledgers and the banks. He turned your grief into his personal treasury.
I gave him my power of attorney, Julian whispered, the horror of his own negligence washing over him. I didn't care about the money. I didn't care about anything after you left. Exactly. A grieving duke is a distracted duke, Clara said. But the well is running dry, Julian. He has bled the estates white, and now he needs a new source of wealth to cover the discrepancies before the next audit. He has set his sights on Louisa's dowry. He is the one who revived the threats, the one who sent the latest letters. He intends to force her into a marriage with his nephew to gain control of her trust. Julian's hand flew to the hilt of the small dress sword at his side, his knuckles white. I will kill him. I will tear him apart with my bare hands. You will do no such thing, Clara said, stepping into his path. You are a duke, not a common brawler, and besides, I didn't spend 3 years building an intelligence network across the continent just to have you ruin it with a clumsy murder. I have the ledgers, Julian. I have the testimonies from the bankers in Vienna and the shippers in Marseille. I have spent every waking hour since I perished ensuring that when I returned, I wouldn't just be a memory. I would be a reckoning. She looked at him then, and for a fleeting second the mask of the vengeful goddess slipped, revealing the girl who had once loved him with her whole heart. I didn't just come back to save Louisa, Julian. I came back to see if there was anything left of the man I once thought was worth the world. The music on stage reached a frantic, dissonant peak as the villain of the opera met his end. Julian looked at Clara, this magnificent, dangerous woman who had been forged in the fires he had allowed to burn, and he felt a surge of protectiveness so fierce it nearly choked him.
There is nothing I can say to earn your forgiveness tonight, Julian said, his voice steadying into a deadly calm, but I will give you my life, my title, and every drop of blood in my veins to finish this. Tell me what to do. Clara smiled then, a small, sharp curve of her lips that held no warmth, only the promise of a storm. The final act is about to begin, Julian. We are going to walk out of this box, hand in hand, and you are going to show the ton exactly what happens when someone tries to steal from the House of Ravenstock. Chapter 5. The opera's final act was reaching its crescendo, but the true drama was no longer on the stage. Inside the private box, Julian reached out, not as a duke commanding a subject, but as a man begging for a second chance at a soul. He took Clara's hand, his thumb brushing over her gloved knuckles, and felt the steady, defiant beat of her pulse. "Let them look," Julian whispered, his voice resonating with a terrifying newfound clarity. "Let them see what a fool I was, and what a queen you have become." He didn't lead her toward the back exit. Instead, Julian unbolted the door and walked her straight to the velvet-draped front of the box. Below, the sea of opera glasses began to tilt upward. A ripple of whispers, like the sound of dry leaves in a windstorm, swept through the stalls.
The music of the orchestra seemed to falter as the Ice Duke stood in the full glow of the chandeliers, hand in hand with a woman in midnight rose, a woman they all recognized from their most scandalous memories. "Julian, look," Clara murmured, her eyes fixed on a figure in the opposite gallery.
Mr. Holloway, the attorney, was standing. His face, usually a mask of professional boredom, was now the color of curdled milk. He saw Clara. He saw the locket Julian was now holding aloft like a captured standard. He saw his ruin. Julian didn't wait. He led Clara out of the box and down the grand, sweeping staircase of the opera house. Every head turned. The rustle of silk and the clicking of fans were the only sounds in the grand foyer as they descended. At the foot of the stairs, Holloway was attempting to make a hurried exit, but he found his way blocked by two men in plain coats, members of the network Clara had spent 3 years weaving. "Mr. Holloway," Julian's voice boomed, a low, predatory rumble that silenced the room. "I believe you have some ledgers that require my immediate signature, along with a full confession regarding the extortion of my sister." "Your Grace," Holloway stammered, his eyes darting toward the crowd. This woman is a known—" "This woman," Julian interrupted, stepping forward so that he loomed over the smaller man, "is the future Duchess of Ravenstock. She is the woman who bled to save my family's honor while I was too blind to see it. And if any man or woman in this room has a word to say against her, they may say it to me, though I suggest you choose your words with the knowledge that I intend to spend the rest of my life making her enemies mine." The silence that followed was absolute. Then, from the shadow of a pillar, Louisa stepped forward. Her face was tear-streaked but radiant. She didn't look at the crowd. She threw her arms around Clara, sobbing her gratitude into the midnight rose silk.
The Tun, ever fickle, saw the embrace of the Duke's sister and knew the wind had shifted. The scandal was dead. A legend had been born. Hours later, the carriage rattled toward Ravenstock House. The high-stakes legal maneuvering had begun, with Holloway being led away to a fate Julian would ensure was miserable. But inside the carriage, the air was quiet. Julian sat opposite Clara, the street lamps casting fleeting bars of light across her face. "You don't have to forgive me," he said softly. "I know 3 years of exile cannot be erased by one night of theater." Clara looked at him, the hardness in her amber eyes finally softening into something like hope. She reached out, touching the gold locket he still held. "I didn't come back for an apology, Julian. I came back because the fire that burned my world down didn't put out the one I felt for you. I don't want to be a ghost anymore." Julian moved to the seat beside her, pulling her into his arms with a desperation that spoke of years of starved affection. He pressed his forehead against hers, breathing in the scent of sandalwood and lilies, the scent of home. "You were never a ghost, Clara. You were the only thing that was real, and I will spend every sunrise proving I am worthy of the woman who walked through fire to find me." In the end, it was not the rubies or the Duke's protection that restored Lady Clara. It was the truth, whispered in the dark and shouted in the light. They say the House of Ravenstock never shone brighter than it did in the years that followed, led by a duchess who knew the price of a secret and a duke who knew the value of a heart. For some stories are born of fairy tales, but the greatest are forged in the flame, tempered by time and held together by a love that refuses to die.